would like to welcome you to the first virtual session of the panel series, We the People and the Future of Democracy, Interdisciplinary Approaches, organized by the European Center for Populism Studies. This panel series follows an in-person conference held between 1st and 3rd of July 2025 at St. Cross College, Oxford University, where scholars, practitioners, and students gathered to explore how invocations of the people shape democratic resilience and backsliding across the globe. The online sessions of the conference will take place between September 2025 and April 2026, scheduled for every second Thursday from 3 to 5 Central European Time via Zoom. I am Stella Schade, an intern with ECPS. I just finished my master's degree of political science at the London School of Economics. Today, we are holding the first session of the virtual panel series under the title of The Rise of Populist Authoritarianism Around the World. In the ongoing journey of our panel series, we extend our gratitude to all the scholars and experts who contribute their extensive insights. With this, I introduce our esteemed chair and distinguished panelists for today's discussion. Our chair for today's panel will be Professor Oscar Mazzoleni. Oscar Mazzoleni is a professor of political science and political sociology at the University of Lausanne, where he leads the Research Observatory for Regional Research. He is currently the principal investigator of the international project Populism and Conspiracy, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation and the Austrian Science Fund. He is co-director of the International Research Laboratory, Parties, Political Representatives, and Sustainable Development at the University of Lausanne in collaboration with Laval University. Today's panel is going to be introduced by David J. Sanders, who is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Essex. Professor Sanders is an internationally renowned expert in British politics and was appointed the UK's first Regius Professor of Political Science. Professor Sanders has been a key figure in the achievements of Essex Department of Government, which has topped the UK politics ranking for the quality of its research in every national research assessment in the last 25 years. Professor Sanders is a fellow of the British Academy and received a special recognition award from the Political Studies Association in 2012 for his commitment to outstanding research, which has shaped public understanding of politics. From 2000 to 2012, he was a principal investigator for the British election study, which is conducted at every general election to study electoral behavior and how elections contribute to the operation of our democracy. This prestigious study was based at Essex from 1974 to 1983 and from 2000 to 2012. Our first presenter will be Dinesh Sharma, a social scientist with a doctorate from Harvard University in human development and psychology. He is currently Director and Chief Research Officer at Steamworks Studio in Central Southern Jersey, consultant at Fordham Institute for Research Service and Teaching, and contributing faculty at Walden University. He was Associate Research Professor at the Institute for Global Cultural Studies, Binghamton University, SUNY, a Senior Fellow at the Institute for International and Cross-Cultural Research in New York City, and a columnist for Asia Times Online, Al Jazeera English, and The Global Intelligence, among other syndicated publications. His biography, titled Barack Obama in Hawaii and Indonesia, The Making of a Global President, was rated a top 10 book of Black history for 2012 by the American Library Association. His next book, The Global Obama, has been widely reviewed and received the honorable mention on the top 10 Black history books for 2014. His book on Hillary Clinton examined the rise of women politicians before the Me Too movement, The Global Hillary, Women's Political Leadership and Cultural Context, and was favorably reviewed. Shoshana Baraschi-Ehrlich is a graduate student from New York City, currently studying at Fordham's Graduate School of Education. Her academic interests focus on the psychological impacts of early life trauma and the integration of mindfulness techniques in clinical settings to support emotional, cognitive, and physical integration. She's also engaged in research exploring the relationship between trauma and democracy. Shoshana is passionate about bridging psychological theory with real-world practice and plans to pursue a career in clinical psychology. For the second paper, we'll be hearing from Michael Makara, who's an associate professor of comparative politics and international relations at University of Central Missouri. He received his PhD and master's in political science from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University and his bachelor's from Virginia Tech. Professor Makara's research focuses on politics and authoritarian regimes and civil-military relations with a regional focus on the Middle East. His research appears in Democracy and Security, Defense and Security Analysis, and the Journal of the Middle East and Africa. At UCM, he teaches a variety of courses related to comparative politics, and Politics of the Middle East. Every year, he leads a study abroad program to Jordan and Israel that aims to challenge students' perceptions of the region. He recently published an article in the Journal of Political Science Education that explores the impact of this program on the extent to which students adhere to common stereotypes of the Middle East. Dr. Makara also sits on the board of directors for the International Relations Council of Kansas City and is the director of Mideast Meets Midwest project to expand opportunities for university students to pursue Middle Eastern studies. Gregory W. Streich is professor of political science and chair of the School of Social Sciences and Languages at the University of Central Missouri. He has published on a range of topics, including democratic theory, social capital, justice, and American exceptionalism. Most notably, he has authored or co-edited 3 books: Justice Beyond, Just Us, Dilemmas of Time, Place, and Difference in American Politics, U.S. Foreign Policy, a documentary and reference guide, and Urban Social Capital, Civil Society and City Life. Additionally, he has won several awards for his teaching and research, including the Distinguished Faculty Award from the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The third paper will be presented by Akis Kalaitsidis, who is professor of political science at the Department of Government Law and International Studies, University of Central Missouri. He received his bachelor's from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville in economics and political science and his master's and PhD from Temple University in Philadelphia in political science. He joined the UCM faculty in 2004. He teaches a variety of classes, including American government, the European Union, world politics, international organizations, and American foreign policy. He was Rotary Peace Fellow at the Rotary Peace Center, Chulalongkorn University's program in conflict resolution, and has been the director of the Missouri-Ghana program and Missouri-Greece program. He's the author of Europe's Greece, A Giant in the Making, published by Palgrave Macmillan and co-edited with Dr. Streich, U.S. Foreign Policy, a documentary and reference guide, among others. His work appears in a variety of journals, book reviews, contributions, and conference publications. The fourth and last paper will be presented by Elizabeth Kosmet-Tatu, who is professor of ancient history at the University of Illinois, Springfield. Trained as both an archaeologist and historian, she approaches Greece holistically from antiquity to the present. In addition to her work on classical and Hellenistic history, she has been taking graduate-level courses in political science and now also teaches democratic theory, global terrorism, and global espionage. Her current political science-related research focuses on post-Civil War Greece, the Papandreou decade, and the broader intersections of populism, democracy, and global politics. Our discussant today will be João Ferreira Dias, who is a researcher at the Center for International Studies within the research group Democracy, Activism, and Citizenship. He's a coordinator of the new European Observatory on Liberalism and Culture Wars at the European Center for Populism Studies and a commentator at CNN Portugal. As a reminder, we will have a Q&A session after the completion of the presentations. Our respected participants can write their questions in the chat box or by raising their virtual hand and pose the questions in person. Now I turn to Professor Mazzoleni, who will provide an overview of the panel subject matter and administer the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Many thanks for organizing this panel and inviting me as a panel chair. I think it's important to underline that democracies are today under threat almost everywhere. While we have also observed some abrupt regime breakdowns, democratic backsliding is the main global trend. Populism plays a crucial role in this trend. The antagonism between an idealized people and their opponent, namely the evil elites, manifests in various ways. Populism is a discourse, an ideology, a communicative style, as well as a relationship between a leader and their followers. It also takes the form of a regime, a kind of constitutional regime that postulates the rule of the people against the rule of law. Unlike fascism, populism is not inherently anti-democratic, However, populism, especially authoritarian populism, seems to contribute in a relevant manner to democratic backsliding by appearing democratic. That's the paradox of our time and the persistent strength of populism. I think this workshop series, including our first panel today, represents a great opportunity to reflect and discuss this important topic across the world. So I really welcome the presentation of today. Thank you very much. I don't know if it's my role to invite to leave the room to the first presentation. So please, we have the first presentation.
Okay, I will proceed. I'm very grateful.
Okay, please.
For this opportunity. Thank you. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to address this very important workshop. There have always been populists. They've always been dangerous, but I honestly believe they are more dangerous now than they have ever been. And I think the survival of democracy is really in question as a result of what's currently happening with populists sharing their experiences across borders and using models to develop ways of attacking democracy. And this means, obviously, that it's extraordinarily important to understand how they work and the sources of their success. And I want to set the scene on the more detailed papers that are being given for the rest of the session today by providing some tentative answers to what I think are the three most important questions about populism. Why has it increased? Why are there more populists about? Why is there more support for populism? Question one. Secondly, why are they so dangerous? And thirdly, what, if anything, can be done to undercut them, to prevent them from damaging democracy, I think, beyond all recognition. And if I try to answer the first of those questions, I want to begin, why has populism increased its appeal? I want to suggest 6 pretty obvious drivers of that increase in support for populism. Some of them we can do something about, some of them we can't. The first thing that I think underpins the growth in populism, certainly in Europe and North America, is the decline in left-right economic discourse. This has been happening for a long time, but it was accelerated fairly obviously after the collapse of Soviet communism in 1990. And the result has been, and this is fairly clear certainly from a lot of British opinion poll evidence, but I suspect the same is true throughout Europe, that large numbers of voters, possibly even a majority, now no longer know what left and right mean. They actually have no comprehension of what the terms mean. And because that's happening, because those terms are losing their meaning, they can no longer act as anchors for voters' support patterns. And without that long-term anchor that was there for so long of left-right discourse, political affiliations are much more fluid, and it opens far more voters up to populist appeals. So that's my first driver of populism. The second driver, I think, has been the rise of post-truth discourse. In my view, this is the unintended consequence of post-structuralism, though you might want to see it as the result of far wider processes than just mere academics. But in a world where there are multiple truths, it's very difficult to sustain evidence-based arguments. And populists thrive in an environment where solid empirical evidence is dismissed as just another truth. The expansion of social media on the internet has exacerbated the problem. Lots of people welcome what's happened with social media. It's meant more voice with a capital V for a lot of previously unvoiced groups, but it's not meant a more reasoned voice. And one of the serious consequences, it seems to me, of the expansion of social media is that it's empowered liars, deceivers, conspiracists, fantasists, and that in turn has increased voter gullibility. And voter gullibility means greater voter susceptibility to the seductive charms of populists. Social media platforms have comprehensively failed to mediate content in ways that inhibit the spread of lies, and that has been a second source of populist success. The third driver, in my view, and this is certainly something that the mainstream media make much of, is the failure of mainstream centrist parties and politics to address the social, political and economic consequences of immigration. We know in Britain that for the last 40 years, immigration has been not necessarily always at the top of voters' issue agenda, but it's been very close, just behind the economy. And yet mainstream politicians have not dared to talk about it because they feared to be illiberal. They've shied away from properly addressing the problems that have followed from mass immigration. And that has provided the impetus for populists to take advantage. And that's something that if we're going to undercut what the populists are doing, we've got to contrive ways of addressing that problem. And in my view, Western European parties are only now starting to do that. The rise of social group identity, which has happened particularly with the internet, it's led to a decline in a sense of common national identity, and that lack of common feeling tends to open up the door to the scapegoating activities of populist parties. And that's a very dangerous development. And again, I think something needs to happen there with regards to addressing that issue. The fifth thing on my list is the failure of mainstream economic discourse to recognize or acknowledge the negative externalities of globalization. It's taken a populist, I think I want to say madman, a populist madman to address the issue in the United States. And we've all seen where that's led. The results being declining economic standards for many, and again, it's a lucrative field for populist appeals. Finally, the sixth factor that I'd identify with the rise of populism is the preparedness of populist politicians to lie and cheat in order to secure power and maintain it. The dangerous tendency of populists internationally to copy each other's constitutional disruptivism is pretty evident. We're having a masterclass in it, as you American-based people will know, in the United States at the moment. We had an example of it in Britain with the Boris Johnson government in the early 2020s, where he tried to subvert the British Constitution quite openly. Fortunately, we had a parliament that was prepared to resist him, whereas you do not have a Congress that's prepared to resist your president. These things are all serious problems for democracy. So my second question, what are the dangers of populism, as if we didn't know? Three, very quickly. Firstly, the demonization of minorities and the resultant increase in social tensions. Secondly, populists, generally speaking, are authoritarian, and there's the concomitant risk that counterproductive repression will be deployed to deal with dissent. And the third problem is that since simplistic solutions, which are typically the solutions offered by populists, do not resolve complex problems, the populists, even when they achieve power, can't ever satisfy voter expectations. And that produces longer-term dissatisfaction and a longer-term weakening of the democratic process itself. I want to address, finally, my third question: what can be done to challenge populism? How can we undercut it? It's sometimes suggested, or used to be suggested, we should let them win office, fail, and be exposed as the shallow charlatans for what they are. Unfortunately, we know from Trump that he can even manage to make a comeback, and he's obviously doing everything he can now to ensure that he wins, he or his cohorts win the next election. So letting them win and fail, I certainly don't think is an appropriate response. What can we do to combat populism in practice? Well, there are a number of things that I'm going to mention here that you won't like. I don't like them myself. My screen has managed to disappear now. I don't know, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, perfect.
You can still hear me. You can still hear me. Oh, good. Okay, so you won't like some of this. I don't like some of this. Well, I think these things have to be thought about. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my internet.
We can perfectly hear you, Professor Sanders.
Okay, it sounds as though you can still hear me.
Yes.
I'll carry on speaking.
Yes,
The first thing
can hear you perfectly.
is to. Okay, the first thing is to do something positive about immigration. I honestly don't know what that could be, but it's absolutely essential that that question is addressed. The British government at the moment is trying at the edges to do something about illegal immigration, and that may undercut some of the difficulties that are currently being created by populists in Britain, but equally it may not. The one thing that I'm absolutely certain of is that all immigrants do need properly to be supported by the state, and that they need to be provided with adequate social security and employment rights. And that's certainly not happening in Britain at the moment, and it ought to be. A second thing that could be done is to develop a new human rights discourse that places less emphasis on individual rights and more emphasis on collective and community rights. This is always a problem, the balance between community rights and individual rights. But what's currently happening at the moment is the populists are using the emphasis on individual rights by mainstream parties as a way of putting pressure on those parties and weakening their position. The third suggestion that one might make is to curb the excesses of globalization by adopting trade and investment rules and agreements that stimulate productive domestic employment and reduce reliance on complex global supply chains. Now, obviously, we have the Trump approach to that, but there are many other approaches that can be adopted instead, and I'm convinced it could still be achieved through collaborative multilateral actions rather than the sort of unilateralism that we've seen from the United States in recent months. A fourth thing that could be done to combat populism is talk up the role of the state in providing a stable arena for investment and productive economic activity. I think we should be stressing the invaluable role played by the state in solving collective action problems like security, education, infrastructure provision, protection of the vulnerable. We need to be honest about the importance of progressive taxes on income and implement policies that reduce nations' borrowing and costs of borrowing by using progressive taxes on income. The fifth approach is to talk up the role of the state in providing and underpinning the formal and informal democratic rules of the game. Democracies need strong institutions to survive and thrive, as well as high public confidence in them. Finally, I would suggest we need to change the rules under which social media companies operate to punish falsehoods, cheating, and the tacit acceptance of criminal activity. And I think we should be draconian in dealing with rule violators. So these are merely generic suggestions. I recognise they all have limits. They're not articulated in any detail. But I think if this workshop series can do anything, it can try to develop more precise answers to the kinds of questions that I'm posing, precise answers that are located in the context of the different countries about which you're writing. But in my view, there's absolutely no doubt that populism is an enormous threat currently, and all intellectual effort should be devoted to combating it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sanders. Very interesting reflection, stimulating reflection. So I think we can move for the first to the first speakers. So about the first presentation, the rise of populist authoritarianism in India and US. Please, you have the floor, colleagues. So Dinesh, Sharma, and colleagues, please, maybe you can share your PowerPoint. Thank you very much. We cannot hear you.
Yeah, I sent the PowerPoint over to
Yes,
the email that was sent in the chat.
I'm trying to
okay.
share it. I just have to.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I think I just have to leave the meeting once so I can share my screen.
Okay.
Maybe I
just do that quickly.
maybe I can try it here.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. You want to do that? I can begin talking. So while the PowerPoint comes up here. So the title of the presentation is really coming from a recent manuscript, a book that's in the works with Bloomsbury. So I'm only going to share a very small snippet of the forthcoming publication. And it's the title roughly is The Orphan Paradox, Destinies, Dynasties, something like that, and Democracies in India and the United States. And the big question that kind of overlaps with populism here is the question of family dynasties and big business corporates and their influence on politics today. So in India, okay, we see the PowerPoint now. In India, as most of you will be familiar, dynastic politics is almost taken for granted over the course of the last 75, 80 years, where the Nehru-Gandhi family has dominated electoral politics for more than half of its independent tenure since India became independent in 1947, became a constitutional republic in 1950. Since then, more than half of its tenure has been dominated by one political party, run by one political dynasty, namely the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. And this has also had, obviously, regional impact. But in India, obviously, we still have effect at the local state level, village level, panchayat level, if you will, where families like the Yadav family, the Thakres in Maharashtra, the DMK in Tamil Nadu have significant influence, right? So there are clearly national conglomerates in India that have a oversized influence on electoral politics, and then there are local families as well at the state, regional, and village level that run politics. Similarly, we find a kind of an interesting comparison. Professor Streich and I have been talking about this as well, where I've shared some of these data points with him. In the US, obviously not the same kind of massive outsized influence, but certainly family influences, whether it's the Kennedys, the Roosevelts, the Bushes, the Clintons, and now potentially the Trumps, have a hold on electoral politics in the United States. And so the effect potentially of dynasties through their recognition, brand recognition, financial as well as political networks, inherited legitimacy, and sustained political influence tends to grip certain segments of the population, and it obviously weakens as dissatisfaction with these families rises and falls. So we're looking in this research, we're looking at the dynamics really of how is it that electoral politics has been captured by political families. And so this is a recent article in Wall Street Journal by well-known columnist Peggy Noonan, who was a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan back in the 80s, whether we're in the America's golden age, as the current president promised us, or the Gilded Age. As you can see, and most of you I'm sure saw the newsreels, the amount of billionaires that were present at his inauguration. Not just from the United States. These are, of course, global conglomerates, corporations, mostly high-tech companies that run the NASDAQ, and their influence on his campaign has been fairly well documented. And just 2 days ago, we had in response to the meeting in Alaska between Trump and Mr. Putin, we had the Shanghai Cooperation meeting in China, and of course the multipolarity, if you will, of the world was quite evidently clear. Whether it's really multipolar in its democratic structure is clearly an open question, because most of these, as one of the columnists pointed out, were mostly autocrats who were uniting against democracies in the West. Okay, so what we see certainly in the United States is the influence of campaign financing. So I think one of the factors that we have to address here as we address populism is to what extent, based on the decision of Citizens United versus FEC 2010 decision that allowed unlimited corporate spending on political campaigns, cementing corporate lobbying power, how much of that has really captured both chambers, if you will, in the United States, upper and lower house, in the United States. In India, similarly, the electoral bond scheme recently struck down by the Supreme Court allowed opaque funding, heavily benefiting ruling parties backed by big corporations. So the global trend that we see from Latin America to Europe, wealthy donors and corporations shape policy through lobbying, donations, and media control. And this is clearly a factor that affects not only the way campaigns are run, the way they're funded, what candidates are put forward, what issues are canvassed. And we see a global synergy here, potentially between multinationals influencing elections in different states and different countries at the same time. Okay. What is the mechanism of influence? Among other things, we see media ownerships of families and conglomerates, whether it's Ambani's in India, Murdoch's in the US, UK, Australia. They shape the political narratives, especially the populist narrative, whether it's resentment, anger, rage towards the elites, as we saw on January 6th in the United States, widely covered by Fox News and other channels, condemned at the time, but then retracted the narrative of insurrection and so on and so forth. And of course, we can get into more details there in terms of how to address that issue. So the policy capture is quite clear in terms of whether we're talking about climate change or gun violence in the United States. Your corporate lobbies are able to influence through tax-based deregulation, subsidies, and trade laws what politicians are able to push or not push in any given election cycle. Like currently with the big beautiful bill, the population is pushing back against cuts to Medicare, but the congressmen who a few of them who've held open sessions don't really resonate to what the population is saying are real cuts to their healthcare. So what we see is a revolving door where politicians and bureaucrats often move into lucrative corporate jobs after office, blurring the distinction between public and private lines. So if you worked in DC, then you can be a lobbyist, and this is a pattern that continues. The counterforces, as previously pointed out, civil society movements, protests, unions, grassroots activism can really constrain the elite dominance. Civil rights movement, Anna Hazare, the people's movement in India, the anti-corruption movement in India, potentially have attempted to dent this, but not to the point where it's changed the control, the dominance or the control of corporates or the big family conglomerates. Certainly the courts, election commissions, free media can check power if they remain strong. But that's, of course, is an open question at this time, even in the United States, I would say. So populism, ironically, many populist leaders, Modi, Trump, AMLO in Mexico, rise, mobilizing resentment against dynasties and elites, even while forging their own power networks. So clearly we can say this, as just pointed out about Mr. Trump and the billionaires that have supported him. Same can be said of Modi as well in India. So the paradox that we're looking at, and this goes back all the way, more behavioral and political science oriented. One of the trends that we see, certainly in the United States and India, is that Americans love to vote for outsiders, whether it's Obama or Trump, who fashions himself as a business outsider. This is a pattern that goes quite back to the very founding of the United States, 1789, where Americans love to elect leaders who've been orphaned. This is a psychological pattern that we found in the data going back 250 years. So we're looking at that to try to see what the correlations are with biographies and narratives that present themselves as individuals who are outside the system and want to have a reckoning with the system. And to what extent they succeed or they're co-opted by the power structure is clearly an open question. But the dialectic that we see certainly both playing out in India as well as in the United States is dynasties and corporations representing institutional inheritance of power, whereas these outsiders, almost orphan leaders, by contrast, rise as disruptors who challenge the entrenched elites. And then democratic voters tend to swing back and forth between the weight of inherited capital and energy of outsiders, self-made or orphan leaders. Ironically, we see this pattern both in India and the United States with remarkable consistency across 18th century, 19th century, and to the present day. So democracies may not be fully controlled by dynasties and big businesses, but they definitely exercise an oversized gravitational pull, bending the arc of democratic choice. The question remains whether institutions and citizens can really resist capture. So I think this is a question that U.S. citizens are right now struggling with, as the current president has flirted with the idea of changing the constitutional norms and maybe running for a third term and so on and so forth. And in the book, I go into more detail in the biographical narratives, really, of leaders that fashion themselves as self-made outsiders, those who rise without inherited power, have no pedigree, no family connections, and then make really an appeal to authenticity and really representing the people, versus dynastic leaders such as Nehru Gandhi family in India, or the Clintons, Cuomos, and Trumps in the United States, who are oftentimes backed by business, inherited power, and are seen as legitimate heirs to the democratic process. So in India, as I've pointed out, Modi definitely presents himself as the native son, who's an outsider, not biographically orphaned, but he left home at a very young age, basically to run away from his home, large extended family, and became a renunciate. And then he came back to politics through becoming an RSS member. Whereas the entrenched elites in India, as I already pointed out, Nehru Gandhi dynasty, and they're, as we speak currently, are fighting for who's going to win the next election, right? In the United States, next slide, I think we see a similar dynamic playing out, where a business family is trying to co-opt structures of power, while the opposition party seems moribund at this time. But we have several contenders at the state level, governors, senators, who literally have been orphaned. J.B. Pritzker, if you look at his biography, lost his mother and father at a young age. Westmore in Maryland, AOC in New York. All of these individuals, if you look at their biographies, have in one form or another have been orphaned, lost a parent or in early childhood, and then became civic leaders for their community as a way of seeking engagement, right? So at this point, I want to stop briefly, and then Shoshana will also speak for a few minutes regarding some case studies that she's also looked at in her own research, which is part of the larger project that we're presenting today. Shoshana, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
So I'm going to just be speaking on a paper that we wrote. But before I begin, I want to note that this is a literary theoretical analysis of successions in autocracies and dictatorships, exploring symbolic patterns, psychoanalytic dynamics, and trauma theory. In this paper, we ask what happens when we bring Freud's Oedipus complex and trauma theory into the study of political succession and leadership. Freud's framework captures desire, rivalry, repression, and ambivalence towards paternal authority. It is also what we might call a just so theory, provocative but impossible to prove empirically. Still, it offers a useful lens for thinking about the drama of authority. In politics, succession crises, especially in revolutionary or authoritarian contexts, can be read as forms of symbolic patricide. The father, whether a dynastic patriarch or revolutionary founder, must be killed, replaced, or repressed, yet also unconsciously repeated. Trauma theory sharpens this picture, as Kathy Carruth and Dominic Lacarpa argue. Trauma is never fully assimilated in the moment. It returns belatedly and repetitively. Political violence and instability often reflect this structure. The unacknowledged loss of authority resurfaces as cycles of rivalry, repression, and renewal. Succession is thus not only institutional, but psychodynamic, shaped by loss and wounds that resist closure. Let me first ground this in 3 modern cases. First, guerrilla movements often enact an Oedipal rupture. Revolutionary leaders position themselves against the paternal figure of the state, staging a violent break from authority. Yet once in power, these same movements reproduce authoritarian structures, mirroring the father they overthrew. The Cuban Revolution, for example, began with an anti-paternal revolt against Batista, but consolidated under Castro as a new patriarchal order. Unresolved trauma from colonial subjugation and class repression finds expression in a repetitive cycle of overthrow and paternal restoration. Second, dynastic transitions show how trauma is bound to inheritance. In authoritarian regimes, succession is haunted by the absent father. Consider North Korea. Each transfer of power is framed as a filial devotion, yet suffused with anxiety over legitimacy and betrayal. The leader's son venerates and symbolically replaces the father, while citizens participate in a family romance, grieving the patriarch even as they transfer loyalty to his heir. Mourning rituals themselves become political performances of unresolved loss. Third, revolutionary figures embody the ambivalence of Oedipal drama. Leaders like Lenin or Mao cultivated images of rupture with the old order, the overthrow of the imperial father, while simultaneously demanding absolute loyalty as new paternal figures. Historical traumas of poverty, colonialism, and war become personalized in their life stories, making political rupture appear as a collective act of healing. Yet the wound is never closed. It resurfaces in purges, betrayals, and cycles of repression. Not all transitions follow this pattern. In democratic systems, power can pass peacefully, even affectionately, from one leader to another. Succession often relies less on patricide than on negotiated continuity, showing that Oedipal readings are most illuminated where trauma and repression dominate political life, but less so where institutions mitigate rivalry. Across these cases, loss is central. Succession is never simply about who rules next. It is a drama of mourning and repetition. The absence of the paternal figure creates a vacuum that must be filled, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully. Citizens are caught in this dynamic, projecting ambivalence towards authority into rituals of loyalty, revolt, or electoral trust. In conclusion, studying succession and political power through Oedipal and trauma theory illuminates politics as a drama of fathers and sons, of rivalry and mourning, of trauma that repeats rather than heals. It helps explain why revolutions often reproduce the very structures they sought to overthrow, why authoritarian dynasties cling to filial rituals, and why democracies at their best can transform rivalry into continuity. Political power, in short, is haunted by loss. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Wonderful and stimulating also as the first one. If we agree, we move on next because the time is going fast. So please, Michael, Makara, Gregory, Streich, you have the floor. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I appreciate the opening remarks, very stimulating. And as Mike cues up our PowerPoint, let me just thank my fellow panelists and also thank the ECPS for organizing not just the conference, but these online workshops that we're happy to participate in. So Dr. Makara and I, our paper is called Outgroups and Elite Cues, How Populists Shape Public Opinion. And so ultimately, to preface the paper that we are delivering, it's part of a larger project, a larger research project. Mike, you can go to the next slide if you can. That where we're focusing on two competing theories of public opinion formation. One we call or is called the social attributes theory, the idea that a person's views of a particular policy might be shaped by the demographic profile of the group that seems to be benefiting from that policy, such as immigration or social welfare programs. And a lot of literature does identify that certain groups, because of their demographic profile, people are more or less likely to support policies that seem to help or affect the other, right? So that's one angle of public opinion formation. There's another theory, and that is often referred to as the elite cues literature, and we call that the follow the leader effect, where the idea here is that people will often retrofit their preferred policy positions to follow their party leader or follow the political leader that they like the most. And so ultimately, what we're trying to look at in our larger research project, and a piece of that is here in our populism paper, is what happens theoretically if, on the one hand, the social attributes theory pulls people to oppose a policy, but the elite cue is pushing them to support that same policy. And so we were trying to figure out which effect has the stronger, which one carries more weight when it comes to shaping public opinion. Additionally, one of the things that we're looking at too is what happens when the leader in question, particularly here, a populist leader like President Trump, takes positions on policies that go contrary to the traditional party platform of, for example, the Republican Party. His tariff policies, for example, go wildly contrary to traditional Republican orthodoxy that supports free trade. And I would argue even his rather harsh approach to immigration goes contrary to Ronald Reagan's invocation of the United States as a shining city on the hill. And people may not remember it, but Ronald Reagan actually passed a form of amnesty for undocumented migrants. And so the Republican Party is being steered towards adopting very different positions than it once held by President Trump. And so that's where we focus on President Trump as a populist. And Dr. Makara, please go to the next slide if you can. Thank you. And so here, just for the interest of brevity, I don't want to go into the long literature review that might be in our paper, but we kind of separated out into discussing populism in two ways. There's kind of research that goes along, I would suggest, two avenues. One would be the theoretical or the ideological. Is populism itself an ideology? Is it inherently right-wing, or are there left-wing versions of it? Here the argument goes back and forth between some people who argue that populism is more or less a style, a rhetorical style that pits the people versus the elites, but that it has to latch on to a more traditional ideology such as conservatism, socialism, or nationalism. There are others that argue that populism has evolved into an ideological framework in and of itself, that it does not need necessarily a host ideology. For example, many people argue that focusing on President Trump, he's not just a conservative, right? And it's not just his style. It's in fact because he adopts kind of what seem to be contradictory policy positions, a little bit of what traditionally might be a democratic policy to protect domestic workers, but then a liberal policy or a conservative policy over here, so that it does kind of create a dynamic of a unique standalone ideology. Now, there's a lot of differences here between those that focus on populism as an ideology, but ultimately, I think there's a consensus that we can agree to, and I think with the empirical analysis as well, that President Trump's style fits the template of a populist leader. The empirical analysis of populism focuses on other elements here, and I think our panelists will also address these as well. What are the conditions under which it emerges? And Professor Sanders nicely talked about the excesses of globalization or reaction to migration or immigration. Those are the kind of those are the elements that populists can feed off of. There are others, and I think others have mentioned this already today. Populism is sometimes referred to as and Dr. Sharma, I think, mentioned it as kind of an outsider strategy. At least in the United States, there's a longstanding tradition of governors or business elites appealing to the people on the idea that they're not from Washington, they're not creatures of Washington, and so they represent common sense or they represent fresh ideas. Elect them, send them to Washington, and they'll shake things up. And so it is kind of a rhetorical strategy that's been used, and many people argue that it's a strategy of desperation of somebody that's trying to get more attention, and it's also a risky strategy because it might attract some voters, but it might repel others, right? And then the empirical analysis also focuses, building on that idea, whether or not populist appeals are effective. And here some of the research concludes that populism, while it seems to have rhetorical appeal and grabs attention, at the end of the day, many people who argue that populism is rather thin, they suggest that it's the policy appeals of the host ideology that do more of the heavy lifting, that populism itself doesn't necessarily win voters over. This is where I think there's a little bit of a gap in the literature that Dr. Makara and I are trying to fill. For example, one of the research studies on the idea that populism may not be all that effective focuses on the question of whether or not you support increasing taxes on the wealthy, and they use that as a marker of support for populism. I would suggest, at least in the United States context, that that's not necessarily a populist position. That's basically a mainstream Democratic Party position. What makes a populist appeal is not just taxing the rich, but talking about the rich as corrupt elites who are selling out the country and screwing the common worker, things of that nature. And so ultimately what we're going to focus on in this particular paper is the extent to which populist leaders can persuade the public, mobilize voters. And the question that we're looking at in particular, there's oftentimes an appeal to outgroup the threat that they might present to the country or the workers or the elites that are selling out the country and becoming wealthy at the expense of the workers. So there is the people versus the elites. But to what extent are populists able to persuade voters and shape public opinion? Is it on issues across the board, or are there particular issues where they find that they have more traction? And here's where we're going to introduce the idea of the salience of a particular issue. If voters already know a lot about it and have a predetermined opinion about it, maybe they are less likely to be influenced by a populist leader. But if they don't know much about it or have an ill-formed or unformed view of that particular issue, that might be the place where populists have the greater pull. And so that's where I will turn the presentation over to my colleague, Dr. Makara, who will walk through our research.
Thank you so much, Greg. And before I get started, I'll just echo what Greg said, just thanking ECPS for organizing this panel and also thanking our fellow panelists for what already has been a very thought-provoking discussion. So looking forward to the rest into the Q&A. I'll pick up on where Greg just left off and mention that, again, this is part of a broader project that we're working on. But really the question that we're focusing on in our paper for this panel and in this presentation here today really boils down to, does a populist's ability to mobilize public support in favor of a preferred political position, is that constant across issues, or is that ability, even among the most charismatic of populists, is that mitigated by the nature of the issues themselves? So as Greg teed up a couple minutes ago, Really, the difference across issues that we're looking at here is the degree of salience. Now, when we think about this, what we're really referring to is, if you have a high salience issue, is this, if I speak colloquially, like a hot button issue that is polarizing, that is discussed, widely discussed in a population, is front of mind when it comes to, for instance, voters going to the polls. By contrast, you might have a low salience issue where you're talking about issues that might not be widely discussed, might not be polarizing, might not evoke an emotional reaction in voters or individuals when they think about it. The comparison that we're going to have in this project that I'll be describing here in just a second is between one high salience issue in the United States, immigration, versus a low salience issue, trade. Now, I am going to talk methodologically about why that comparison makes sense in the context of our study, whereas, in 2025 in the US, trade is becoming a little bit more salient, but I will talk about that here just coming up. But when we take a look at, Greg mentioned the elite cues literature, this idea that elites or populists are able to mobilize supports in favor of a preferred political position, it's really going to be that you see that is represented in our first two hypotheses on the screen here. So basically, hypothesis one looks at basically states that conservatives will be more likely to support a proposed immigration policy when that policy is endorsed by President Trump. Hypothesis two looks at basically the same thing, an elite cue or follow the leader effect when looking at trade. But where we're really interested in this project is looking at hypothesis three. And it is the idea that that the magnitude or the strength of that cue might vary across these different issue areas. So our hypothesis is that the effect of elite cues will be stronger for low salience issues like trade in our case than it is for high salience issues like immigration. As Dr. Streich mentioned, the reason behind that is essentially, to put it maybe just, again, colloquially, is this idea that when it comes to those high salience issues, individuals and voters have already made up their minds, and they're less susceptible to the persuasive abilities, perhaps, of any political leader. So to test these hypotheses, we actually ran a national survey that included two factorial experiments. Essentially, in our survey, and this is, I'll mention a little bit of a broader project, but what I'll talk about here are essentially two different vignettes that articulate two fictional policies, one for trade and one for immigration. What we ask survey respondents to do is to read each vignette and to respond simply whether they support that proposed policy or not. The only thing that varies between the two, at least that we're talking about here, is whether we tell respondents that President Trump has endorsed that policy or not. I'll give you a sense of what the vignettes are here in the upcoming slides, but that's just a general overview of what we're looking at. We have binary variables then that we run in a logistic regression analysis representing ideology and then Trump's endorsement, essentially that key independent variable that we're looking at. There are a number of others as well that you'll see when I present the analysis here. But we run that logistic regression, and the idea is to see first, do we see that follow the leader or elite cues effect for both policy proposals? And then does the magnitude of the effect vary across the two? Before I share the data, I'll just share the vignettes real quick. And I'm not going to read these because I'll let you do that if you'd like. But again, the immigration vignette shares a fictional immigration policy that is, some voters are being told is supported by President Trump. If you remember, about a year or so ago, there was a conversation in Congress in the United States about, some sort of immigration compromise. It roughly reflects that, if you're familiar with that, with that debate. I will say a couple of things about this, just about wording and just about some of the details that you see here. So first, you see that when respondents are presented with this vignette, it is varying across more dimensions than simply whether President Trump endorses the policy or not. So you can see we actually varied that sort of endorser by just sort of a generic government officials, former President Biden, as well as Donald Trump. We're only focusing on President Trump here in this particular paper, but one of the things we plan to do moving forward is to, again, compare the effect of Trump on, to the effect, for instance, on Biden. I will also say some of the very subtle wording here is important. You see, I refer to President Biden and former President Trump. That gives you a little bit of a cue of when we ran this survey, which was actually at the end of September 20. That's actually crucial, not only for the wording here, but also just to alert you to the fact that even though trade is very salient in the US today as a political issue, it wasn't necessarily so back in September when we ran the survey. So just a methodological point that I'll point out. Dr. Streich also mentions that we're looking at the social attributes, right? The social attributes of those who are being discussed. This isn't a very good example of this. We have a couple of other vignettes that do this a little bit better. But here, that's where we see that we've referred to immigrants either as illegal aliens or undocumented immigrants, trying to see if that framing really affects how people respond to the question that we presented. Now, we don't look at the effect of that variable here, but just to foreshadow a little bit, I did run the analysis including that variable, and it doesn't really change the results that I'm going to be sharing here coming up. This just gives you a sense of what the trade vignette is. Again, there's a trade policy focused on semiconductor chips. I think tariffs are mentioned in here. Do you support this policy given if we tell you that it is President Trump who is endorsing it? So this is essentially what we presented to respondents, and we ended up running a logistic regression analysis that crunches all this together and tries to identify some patterns in what we see. The first thing I'll mention is that we present on the screen here the odds ratios for each of the variables that appears in our logistic regression model. That essentially looks at the odds that an individual will support the proposed policy when the variable listed is present. And it compares that to the odds that an individual will not support that policy or will support that policy when the variables of interest are not present. So basically, the way you want to interpret what's on the screen here is that an odds ratio of 1 essentially means that there's nothing going on here. There's no effect that that variable is having on the likelihood that someone is going to support either the trade or the immigrant policy that we propose. An odds ratio of greater than 1 means that there is a positive relationship, with higher numbers and higher the larger numbers indicating a stronger relationship. Less than 1 indicates a negative relationship, and as you approach 0, that's going to represent relationships of a greater magnitude in that direction. Now, I'm not usually a fan of just putting regression output up on a PowerPoint slide. So let me walk you through, as I'm looking at our hypotheses, what are we initially looking at? So look at hypothesis 1. This is where I'm really looking at what is the impact that President Trump's endorsement has on support for the proposed immigration vignette. Here you see that that's quite large odds ratio of 4.2 or so indicates that conservatives who are told that their president supports this policy are essentially 4 times more likely to support that policy themselves than are other members of the sample or other individuals who are sampled. And this is when controlling for other variables like ideology and others that you see. Notably here as well, President Trump is having essentially the opposite effect on liberals. So that odds ratio of roughly 0.4 or so suggests that President Trump is really turning off liberals to this policy when controlling, again, for these other variables. We can look at the same thing for the trade vignette as well. So if we come over here, looking at hypothesis 2, here we note that there is still a very strong pull that President Trump is having on conservatives when it comes to trade, and that's the magnitude of that effect on liberals is in a way equally strong. So here we see that this elite cues effect really in sort of confirming or providing evidence for hypothesis 1 and 2 seems to be doing quite a bit of work. That said, our real interest is in looking at the comparison across. Is there variation in the degree to which President Trump is able to mobilize support among conservatives or turn off liberals, essentially. And here what we see, there's a little bit more nuance here. So a first cut at this would just be to compare President Trump's the effect that he's having on support among conservatives, comparing across the trade and immigration vignette. And we do see, sort of in support of our hypothesis, that that effect is moderately stronger among the trade vignette. And again, this is what we predicted, given that our sense is that individuals would not be primed to have very well thought out opinions about this issue prior. Same thing here, we can see that there is a pretty significant effect, a pretty significant difference in the effect that President Trump is having when it comes to turning off liberals as well. Now, the question you might be asking yourself, and this isn't presented here, but we did run some additional analysis, is, well, is that relationship statistically significant? Here, the results are a little bit mixed, where it is for Trump's, essentially the interaction between Trump and liberals, which suggests that there really does seem to be something going on here when it comes to the degree to which Trump is going to turn liberals off from his proposed policies. We did not see that when it comes to the difference between these two variables right here, though. We don't have statistical confidence just in that comparison that that effect is due to the difference in levels of salience that we see across these two issues. Having said that, there are some additional clues that we look for. So for instance, if we take a look up here on our regression table, what we can actually see is that for the trade vignette, the collective takeaway from these data are that individuals don't have very well developed opinions entering into or before they're taking this survey. Essentially, what we see is that when it comes to ideology, this isn't having very much of an effect on support for the proposed trade policy until you add President Trump's endorsements. So the difference here between these odds ratios looking at for sex, education, liberal, conservative, the fact that there's not a whole lot going on there until you add Trump's endorsements suggests to us that first, this is what we would expect to see in a low salience issue, and that President Trump's endorsement seems to be doing a lot of work. By contrast, what we can see is that when it comes to immigration, much like our hypotheses predict, this does seem to be a very high salience issue. Liberals and conservatives are very divided when it comes to this issue, regardless of what President Trump says. Here, though, what we see is that even though President Trump's endorsement is having a pretty significant effect, it's more reinforcing an effect that's already there than it is creating an effect that didn't exist prior. So even though we don't see a statistically significant difference between President Trump's endorsements among conservatives when you look across the immigration and trade vignettes, we do see other reasons to believe that the dynamics we suggest are indeed playing themselves out. An additional statistical study, I think, would likely confirm that as well. One thing I'll mention just as I wrap up, and I didn't have tons in terms of next steps, but Dr. Streich did mention this is part of a bigger project. We are looking at those attributes as well, bringing them into the analysis. We are interested in comparing this across leaders too. So if this is this something that's unique to President Trump, or would we see something similar among, if people are told that President Biden, former President Biden, is the one who is endorsing? Some additional variables we're interested in as well. What about level of political knowledge? What about source of information, preferred media sources and things like that? So this is really just a first cut at the data. But really appreciate having the opportunity here to let you know a little bit about what we're thinking about, and we very much look forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. So we have, I think, we try to have some time at the end for discussing your presentation too. So going ahead from to the Akis Kalaitis presentation, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the invitation. My paper has to do with, it's titled actually economic catastrophe to political catastrophe. I'm looking at the roots of populism and its effect on the political system of 4 different countries who experienced financial troubles from 1997 to 2015. Those 4 countries are Thailand, Argentina, Greece, and the United States. Basically, the argument is that the economic dislocations and financial problems have fueled populism in all 4 countries, and have given us distinct types of populism, which are related to the cultural values of each country. I'm going to go through each country, and I'm going to talk to you about the strategies that each of the populist regime used to succeed and overturn and destroy the previous political order. Well, starting with Thailand, which is for me the most difficult one because I don't speak Thai and had very little time to do research there. The Thaksin Shinawatra is a businessman who came to power following the 1997 economic catastrophe, the collapse of the baht. The baht is the economic unit there, the money. He formed a coalition of rural poor farmers with, of course, the evidence of the argument that the Bangkok elites were destroying the country, and proceeded to provide a populist policy of essentially free healthcare. 30 baht is less than $1. You pay 30 baht to go to the hospital, something that was not available before to the poor of the country. Also, he spent 1 million baht, which is about $25,000 per village in the rural areas, of direct payments to the villagers, essentially, to do what they want to do in their area. And debt relief for the farmers of Thailand, which was a hugely popular effort. So along the populist line, we have policy populism, we have rhetorical populism, we have an organizational strategy and a leadership style, and a media and mobilization style. So first, the policy populism in Thailand was those 3 major policies. Then the rhetorical populism was the rural masses versus the Bangkok elites. That is something that is formulated in most, as you've heard from my previous colleagues, of course, in most populist regimes. And then the organizational strategy is to create a new political party in the Thai politics, the Thai Rak Thai party, which he ran as a personal fiefdom. And so it becomes a question of what does that party going to do? And basically, the party does turn the country from liberal to an illiberal democracy, sort of. Though Thailand is a question mark because they have a king, and the palace gets to sometimes decide the politics of the country. The leadership style is a charismatic CEO, technocratic. I have the largest telecommunications company in Southeast Asia, and I'm going to sell it to the Indonesians and buy Manchester City and sell it to the Arabs and make $1 gazillion. And the media mobilization is rural outreach, a modernization message, and complete domination of the airwaves. So then that's the nutshell of populism in Thailand. I will talk about its effects at the end after I talk about the other three cases. In Argentina, in 2001, the country experienced its own financial crisis. Basically, the country was bankrupt. Urban working classes, public employees, low middle income people have suffered tremendously. It was a extremely stressing situation for all Argentinians, which gave rise to Kirchnerism. I apologize. Nestor Kirchner was the president who came in as a populist leader in Argentina. He died very soon after the first negotiations with the IMF, and his wife, Cristina Fernandez Kirchner, took over. So we call it Kirchnerismo for short, in the style of populism. And their populist policies were social spending expansion, welfare mainly, and pensions. So the vulnerable levels of society were paid direct money. Then there was subsidies for energy and transportation. So you also got money for your heating bill and your bus fare. And of course, the renegotiation of the debt with international organizations such as the IMF, which is critical to many of these cases, including Thailand, but very critical for Argentina, who has been very obstinate against negotiating this. In fact, this was their leadership style. To go over the leadership style of Cristina Fernandez Kirchner. Not only she was the symbolic defender of the poor, but also she was the defender of Argentina against the IMF. In a personal interview with Kirchner's economics minister, he said, "Don't believe the IMF, they're lying." It's a direct quote. And it was surprising to me because he was the lead negotiator for Argentina. So it seemed to me that there were very difficult relationships between the two, and the Argentinians used this difficult relationship to climb politically and destroy the previous order, the previous political order. The media mobilization was not complete in Kirchner's Argentina. There was, although, heavy use of state media to attack the opponents and to maximize their potential electoral benefits. So it became sort of a lower middle class, unions, old Peronist networks, and the political party of Cristina Fernandez Kirchner versus the IMF, essentially. And in Greece, which follows the Argentinian situation in 2008, you have a broad anti-austerity coalition, mostly again pensioners and youth, which are the most vulnerable in society in terms of the financial dislocations from the global financial catastrophe. And the policy populism was an anti-austerity platform, a promise of debt relief, a restoration of pensions and some wages, not a lot, a halt on privatizations, which were ordered by the Troika, and of course, the rhetorical populism strategy was the Greeks versus the Troika. The Troika being the IMF, the European Union, and the ECB. Organizational strategy was leftist activists mostly, social movements, and a political party that was founded as a coalition government. It was a youthful leader. The leadership style is Tsipras, who was a youthful leader who was going to change the politics of Europe, not only Greece, but of Europe, by refusing to wear a tie. So basically, essentially sort of showing his anti-establishment credentials that way. And the media mobilization was massive rallies and a referendum on whether or not Greece should be part of the Eurozone. Excuse me. And basically, the referendum ended up going the way the government wanted to, anti-European, but the government caved at the last minute and negotiated an agreement with Europe, and Greece is still part of the Eurozone. And finally, Trump's United States. Well, that's the social base is a white working middle class, rural voters, and disaffected conservatives. The policy populism is tax cuts, tariffs, American first protectionism, deregulation, and severe immigration restrictions. As my colleagues said before, immigration, several of you, immigration is a salient issue for many people in the United States. And so that was used as a vehicle to attack the establishment. The rhetorical populism, of course, is, you probably all know about it, is real Americans versus corrupt Washington elites. We will drain the swamp, famously was the saying. And we will clean the country from immigrants who are nothing but a burden on, not to mention the rapists and killers and whatever else he said out there. The organization strategy is the capturing of the Republican Party by the MAGA movement. So as my colleague Gregory Streich mentioned, these are not the Reagan Republicans. This is a new breed of Republican. And the leadership style is businessman, technocrat, strongman. Basically just like Thaksin in Thailand. And media mobilization is use of the social media and denunciation, as our first colleague, Professor Sanders said, multiple truths in a permanent campaign, constantly using the ratings as a guide of where you're going politically. And so the legacy of these policies in the 4 countries that I'm looking at is variable very little, because essentially all the systems, the previous establishment systems have been destroyed. These countries are not going to be the same again. Politically speaking, even though Thaksin was, and he's the biggest outlier, even though Thaksin was chased out of the country and lived in UAE for a good 10 years, his daughter is back, and well, she was apparently thrown out of her position as prime minister 48 hours ago, because of the situation with Cambodia. You know, that it does not matter, but still, what matters is while the regime, the populist regime, is being suppressed by coup d'etats by the military. There is violence in the streets of Bangkok, and the populist version of the Thai Rak Thai party continues unabated. So they are there, they're going to be there for a long time, and no matter what the Thai military does, they have to deal with them. In Argentina, the electoral pendulum swung the other way in an exclusionary populist type of regime with Milei. However, the Cristina Fernandez Kirchner, she's still there, and her party is still very dominant. But the fact is that populism is still the way that the Argentinians are going to go. They're still going to fight the IMF. They're still going to be obstinate about negotiations and restructuring their debt. In Greece, the populist peak was destroyed because the leadership of Syriza changed. Syriza sort of collapsed. There's still many political parties that are inclusionary and exclusionary populist parties that operate. There's just many as opposed to one, and they're all attacking the establishment. Now, from the nationalists and the Nazis to the communists and the leftists, you have a changed political structure in the country. And finally, of course, in United States, Trumpism is going to reshape politics, as many of my colleagues have said before, in many different ways, from Congress to elections. In our state, in Missouri, we are redistricting to make sure that no Democrats ever get elected again. And so that change is going to be permanent, in my opinion. So finally, the lesson is that populism is not merely a rhetoric, but a structural response to globalization's dislocations. Economic crises highlight the tensions between national democracy and global markets, and populism thrives in this gap, demanding sovereignty, but often colliding with external constraints. I appreciate your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So last but not least, the last presentation by Elizabeth Kosmetatou and Akis Kalatitis. Please, you have the floor. The question is also, I don't know, EPCS, how you want to, when you have to finish the Zoom connection, because we have 25 minutes. So I don't know if you have 5 minutes more, or I don't know, because of course, otherwise we have no time for discussion, and we cannot just ask Elizabeth Kosmetatou to speak only 10 minutes because of the discussion. So please let us know by when we can continue our very interesting workshop.
Oscar, I think we can stay, if everybody agrees, for 10 minutes more, because we have a discussant. Also, we would like to have some time for the Q&A session as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I have a problem here. Why can't I? All right, I'm trying to share.
Yes, perfect.
And do the whole thing. I mean, like, okay, I'll try. How do I do? First, I do slideshow, and then how do I share? Because I don't see you anymore if I do full screen. Anyway, I'll try to do it like this. And okay, I mean, yeah, that's the best I can do. All right, so populism and clientelism, the Greek state under Andreas Papandreou. I'll try to be brief, not 10 minutes, but brief. So Andreas Papandreou, who lived from 1919 to 1996, was one of the most consequential and controversial figures in modern Greek history. His premiership, which is from 1981 to 1989, and then from 1993 to 1996, reshaped the state through a blend of populism and clientelism. The strategies mobilized broad sectors of society, but also entrenched patterns of dependence. His career spanned dramatic decades, the turbulence of the 60s, exile during the dictatorship, triumphant return after democracy, was restored in 1974, and the premiership in the years that I mentioned. These were transformative years for Greece. The consolidation of democracy after its restoration, accession to the European Economic Community, now European Union, and the challenges of modernization and European integration. Papandreou's style combined populist rhetoric, appeals to the people, promises of social justice, nationalist independence, and sharp attacks on elites, with clientelist practices, especially the distribution of jobs in the public sector and state resources in exchange for loyalty. Together, these strategies reshaped politics and left a long shadow over governance. So, his early life, he's the son of George Papandreou, who was a great figure, central political figure, popularly known as the great man, the old man of democracy. His mother was Sofia Minejko, who was of Polish-Lithuanian descent. And you can see he was Harvard-trained economist. He founded PASOK in 1974. After the fall of the junta of 1967-1974, and he blended academic intellect with charismatic populism. So he was arrested in 1939 already by the authoritarian Metaxas regime for links to a Trotskyist group called Proletarios. He signed a penance declaration, this was a thing in Greece, and fled to the United States, where he reinvented himself. He became a professor in Minnesota, Northwestern University in Berkeley, where he chaired the economics department. In 1963, he returned to Athens, entered politics under his father's center union, and he quickly rose to power. By 1964, he was Minister of Government Coordination, therefore shaping economic policy. But in April 1967, the colonels took over power. You can see them here with the former King Constantine II. He was imprisoned. Papandreou was arrested and imprisoned, then exiled in Sweden and Canada, and he founded, as I said, PASOK. In the 1975, the first free elections, he won about 13% of the vote, but 6 years later, he swept to power with more than 48%, which is very unusual for Greece. So, okay, he was under his father's shadow, for sure. George Papandreou Sr. had been a fixture in politics since 1920s. He opposed the monarchy, sort of, whenever it fit him, championed reforms, and was known as a powerful orator. I would argue even that his son was even better than him as an orator. His governments faced, he didn't rule for a very long time. His governments faced immense pressure from the palace, which was interfering too much in politics, the military in Washington, all suspicious of his tolerance of dissent and his willingness to change royal authority. Now, I have to say here that in 1946, there was a civil war in Greece that lasted until 1949 between the communists and the government. The government won with backing from the United States mainly. So for the next decades, there was immense suppression of any dissent. If you were a communist, that's it. You would be sent to exile on a desert island or worse. So already in the 1960s, CIA reports, which have been declassified, describe him as leftist, critical in US policy on Cyprus, and suspected of organizing Aspida, a left-leaning group within the army. Though groomed to succeed his father, that they said, he was already contemplating a break from the Center Union, which of course he did in 1974. So he was, by 1967, he was a darling of young voters and left-of-center groups, but still seeking American aid with no strings attached, as CIA said already in 1967, about a month before the coup. His politics already combined radical rhetoric with pragmatic calculation, traits that would mark his premiership as well. So there have been two attempts at a psychological profile of Andreas Papandreou. The CIA analyzes him, of course, but there is this book written about him, a memoir by former US Ambassador Monteagle Stearns, who was a prominent American diplomat. And he wrote this nuanced portrait of Papandreou, although I think it is a bit biased. It's called Gifted Greek. He had known Papandreou since the 1950s. They were really friends together. So we see them here, Monteagle Stearns and his wife and Papandreou in those days. So he watched him transform into a fiery socialist, denouncing the very country where he had built his career, basically. Their friendship mirrored the US-Greek alliance itself, close but fraught. And then we have Gerald Post, the late and much lamented, who used to work for the CIA. He was a psychiatrist with a PhD also in political science, and who wrote, they have only classified a portion of that psychological profile called the Terminal Machismo Andres Papandreou of Greece. It's clearly part of a longer classified document. It labels Papandreou as a narcissist, arguing that his brush with death in 1988 led to the destabilization of his personal life, which in turn had destabilizing effects on his political career. Erroneously, in my opinion, he attributed the 1989 loss of Andres Papandreou to the fact that he divorced his wife and married a much younger woman, 30 years his junior, a flight attendant called Dimitragliani. He basically brushed off the economic scandals of the Papandreou government, which according to me were much more significant. I don't think many of his followers cared about Liani either way. And there were many people who supported her too. So Papandreou's politics fit what scholars call extraordinary or charismatic leadership. Unlike rational legal leaders who reproduce existing norms, charismatic leaders, as we know, disrupt them. A very interesting book discussing all that is by Takis Papas, which argues that populist leaders belong to that category of extraordinary leaders whose legitimacy is personal rather than institutional. So Papandreou created a movement around himself. This is why, of course, after his death, there was a decline in PASOK and almost total collapse. It's probably irrelevant already. But the 1980s will be remembered always as the Papandreou years. He handpicked ministers, dismissed them abruptly, and filled the bureaucracy with loyalists. For example, in 1982, he fired Deputy Foreign Minister Asimakis Fotilas after he returned from a European Community meeting where he had diverged from whatever Papandreou had told him to do. And his charisma was enacted through performance. I mean, he was a master in that. He was a gifted storyteller. He portrayed Greece as shackled by foreign powers, declaring, Greece is a dependent country, we are a colony. His language was equally potent. He used demotic everyday Greek, a lot of slang, rather than the formal style of earlier leaders. His slogans became iconic, αλλαγή, change. Η Ελλάδα ανήκει στους Έλληνες, Greece belongs to the Greeks, and consigning opponents to the χρονοδούλαπο της ιστορίας, which would be translated as the time cupboard of history, the dustbin of history would say, probably, in English. He played on nativism, casting the virtuous people against corrupt outsiders. In the 1980s, the outsider was first the United States, blamed for the junta, and Cyprus, and later Germany, associated with austerity. That Papandreou himself had been an American professor only made his anti-Americanism more powerful. Charisma also required mobilization. His rallies drew hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes even 1 million. Unions supported him, strikes surged, mass politics defined that decade. And among his performance, I will put this here, he fashioned the turtleneck, which Tsipras later finished when he was modeling himself after Papandreou, and of course the PASOK mustache. These are 6 weeks. People, they're like legendary, iconic mustache, let's say. So unions, as I said, supported him. Let's look at Greece. How did Greece? Oh, one more thing. I love that. So the word salad of PASOK. So this is exemplified by this quote I found of Akis Tsochatzopoulos, who was a very powerful politician in PASOK, who allegedly offered the following word salad. This is a newspaper excerpt that I found. The first priority of PASOK is the productive restructuring of institutions in combination with social processes, which through redistribution and the consensus of actors and institutions, secure structural cohesion and justice. Yeah, okay. We'll shuffle the deck, hand out some goodies and keep everyone quiet so the system holds together, or we'll hand out jobs and subsidies so nobody rocks the boat, something like that. Okay, so let's look at Greece's shifting economy. After World War II, Greece was in shambles, and it was basically rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid. It repaid its debts and maintained balanced budgets. Debt hovered around 20% of GDP in the 1970s, even as other European states expanded welfare programs through borrowing. With entry into the European Union in 1981, money came in, like lots of money, and little oversight. European funds poured in, borrowing soared, clientelism deepened, corruption in procurement and contracts became widespread, often rumored at 10%. Public debt rose from 23% of GDP in 1981 to 71% in 1991. Persistent trade deficits compounded the problem. While distinct from budget deficits, they interacted to increase Greece's vulnerability. CIA assessments at the time warned that populist spending, external deficits, and weak administrative control created growing strains on the Greek economy. And they said that around 1983 and 1986. By the time Greece entered the euro in 2002, public debt had reached 117% of GDP. Many argue the roots of the 2010 crisis lay in politics entrenched in the 1980s. I'll try to go briefly over his Syntagma Square speech of 1981, 3 days before the election. The theme was Allagi. He promised liberation from one-party dominance, casting PASOK as a kinema movement rather than a party. Citizens were not passive voters, but co-authors of a dawn of freedom. His promises were sweeping: universal healthcare, higher pensions, free daycare, reduced military service, all without taxes. He actually said that. He denounced the European community as imperialist. His performance mattered for more than the details. Eyewitnesses recall the atmosphere: Syntagma Square overflowing, banners waving, chants of Allagi rolling like waves through the crowd. State television carried the speech nationwide, turning it into a shared national moment. For many Greeks, it was the most electrifying political event of their lives, comparable to Perón's balcony speeches in Buenos Aires or Chávez's marathon addresses in Caracas. So there was reform, but also contradiction. Immediately, Papandreou stayed in NATO, of course, and the European Union, and he tried to bargain for aid from the United States, insisting on the 7-to-10 ratio of military assistance with Turkey, and used anti-Western themes when needed. Again, CIA documents reveal that the United States was pretty worried that democracy in Greece was very fragile. It might again lead to that his rule might lead to another coup, which didn't happen. He also implemented real reforms, to be honest. The new National Health Service, which expanded access to hospitals and clinics. Family law was liberalized. It's true, it was crazy. Strengthening women's rights in marriage and divorce. Universities were restructured with student participation in governance, a dramatic shift in academic culture, and for the first time, the Greek national resistance of the German occupation years was officially recognized, an act of symbolic justice for a generation excluded from the national narrative. Those reforms did not solve all problems, but they transformed daily life for many. But it was an unstable government, so cabinet reshuffles 13 times in 8 years. Informal decision-making, personal networks, corruption, scandals, and ballooning debt. Now, corruption was not something that Greece had not seen before. For example, I'm giving you here the campaign, a poster of the campaign of Konstantinos Mitsotakis, who was the leader of opposition in the latter Papandreou years, and later Prime Minister of Greece from 1990 to 1993. He was a fixture in politics as well. And I'll translate the crazy things that it says here. Cretan, vote Cretan. Vote for the Liberal Party. Vote for Kostas Mitsotakis. That's from years ago, years before. More than 30,000 people have been appointed, that is, to public sector positions without competitive exam, their emphasis. As was denounced in Parliament to OTE, telephone company ELTA, the mail company, Energy and other organizations in the last 3 years. We Cretans, both on and off the island, make up 12% of Greek population. Our proportion of these appointments should have been more than 3,600 people. Do you know of any Cretan who was appointed? So he's promising jobs. He admitted it also in one of his final interviews with Alexis Papachelas, which was a comprehensive looking back at his career. So public jobs equal political loyalty, distribution of state resources, patronage networks across Greece, empowered marginalized groups, but fostered dependency. Yes, there was corruption, but corruption under the Papandreou years was reached the stratosphere, and it became part of Greek political life. So all parties, even today, do the same. I mean, right now, Greece has this OPEKEPE scandal, which is really bad, and of course implicates the government. But here is how debt went, lovely, and even later, of course. And the Koskota scandal was the biggest scandal in under his premiership. And yes, eventually he found true love. This is Dimitraliani, who increasingly control access to him. Eventually, he died in 1996. You see scenes from his funeral. This is a crazy thing the Greeks do. Before they put a person on the ground, they open the casket and people have to go there and kiss the dead person. His grave, of course, has an inscription, Greece belongs to the Greeks. Papandreou was the answer to many people who had suffered in the previous decades. We see here communists being exiled. This is an area, I think this is Yaros, one of the desert islands. People had to actually make a literal declaration of social convictions. This is it. And here it says, actually, you had to go to the police station to say that, I'm totally conservative, I hate communism, and then you would get this attestation or certificate that said he can get a job. I mean, this is one which literally says she has done this and this and that, and therefore she can be appointed, she can get a job. He's still adored by many. Here's a guy who died, and on his grave, he asked that they inscribe this: I lived 90 years. I only lived a good life during those 8 years, those 8 Papandreou years, which is insane, but yeah. Okay. He has had a lasting impact on Greece. He consolidated Greek democracy. This is true. I mean, during his years, I mean, yeah, it would be unthinkable for Greece to have a dictatorship again. It strengthened European integration. This is true, despite his rhetoric. But he became also a model of charismatic populism, and his legacy is personalized politics and institutionalized governance. So, nearly 30 years after his death, it will be next year, Papandreou remains both fascinating and polarizing. To admirers, he was the liberator who brought Allagi. He was, to critics, the architect of corruption and debt. But what cannot be denied is his mastery of charismatic populism. He filled Syntagma Square with hundreds of thousands, told stories that reframed Greece's place in the world and its narrative, and convinced citizens that history itself was in their hands. One early PASOK slogan captured the spirit, rendezvous με την ιστορία, appointment with history. As a historian, I may cringe at the misuse of the word history, but the message was clear. It reflected a mentality and captured the emotions of the moment. In the end, Papandreou left not just reforms and scandals, but the memory of an era when one man's charisma could move a people, redefine national identity, and place Greece on a contested path within Europe and the global order. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. for your presentation, interesting presentation. I think we have to move to the discussion. And please, João Ferreira Dias, let us know. You have the floor. Let us know your questions. And of course, we have to be quick and fast. We have 15 minutes. So I ask everyone to be very short in the questions and responses to the remarks. So please, you have the floor, but try to be short. Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. Are you listening?
Yeah.
The sound is good? Okay. It was very fantastic presentations with many aspects to be explored. I will try to get to the point from a food for thought perspective. I also read the abstracts, and my comments will reflect that. Concerning the initial discussion, I prefer to see populism as a discourse and a performance that can be incorporated into different kinds of ideologies. That's my perspective. In that sense, populism is related to social and political polarization linked to culture wars. It is my research topic, my main research topic. Okay, let's go straight to the presentations, to the papers. Okay, paper one related to dynasties and big business. So it was a very refreshing presentation in conceptual terms, I would say. The concepts of orphans, patricians, and entrenched elite are very interesting and important. If I may say, since being an orphan allows populists to present themselves as part of the people against the power, or against the elite, while being part of the entrenched elite may be a problem, but it can be solved by performing stability, experience, and success. Both can be effective in terms of nationalism. That is something that it's always on my research and my studies. The question of ethno-nationalism is very important, and how populism affects this. In that sense, symbolic drama is also indeed very important in terms of a psychological and even spiritual renewal of the nation. That idea that the drama can renew the spirituality, the psychological identity of the nation. So I have many things to say. So it may be relevant in my perspective to deepen and highlight the paradox that both Trump and Modi represent, and how they in fact employ a populist agenda to promote illiberal and autocratic regimes. I think this is very important. This is a topic from my point of view, considering the fact that both Trump and Modi claim to represent the voice of the people against the elite, while that narrative hides tactical alliances with political and economic lobbies like the techno boys and so on. In fact, if we pay attention to the history, dynasties are part of political furniture, if I can use this term, since monarchy. So, and remains present in democracies. The idea of dynasties is atemporal. That's a fact. What is new is this coincidentia oppositorum, if I may say, use this Latin concept, between oligarchies, dynasties, and anti-establishment populism, and how it was shown. The fact that elites appeal to drama to achieve and preserve power while claiming to represent the interests of the people. This paradox is the key of this presentation, and I think it was a great presentation. So it was as fast as I can go for the paper one. I think I can go all the papers, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So paper two. How to group and the elite coups. The paper is exciting and promotes important discussions from my perspective. The in-group, out-group concepts remains pivotal in populist strategies. This is my academic perspective. Both Trump and the European populist leaders claim to defend the biocultural identity of their nations. This is related to the idea of ethno-nationalism, which is called the ethno-nationalism. So, as Amanda and Winter shown in their studies, both Brexit and the Trump elections shared the working class male anxiety about migration and family support. This is something very important. The idea of migration anxiety is something that we all share in our studies. We all find in different kind of populist leaders and their social support. In fact, the impact of anxiety and dignity is related to economic welfare. This is crucial. An important and crucial issue after the 2009 crisis, as we all know. All of us who studied populism know that the 2009 crisis was the changing moment for the populism. What caught my eye was the concept of follow the leader effects and social attributes effects. I really enjoyed those concepts. I believe both came together, both concepts. Once again, taking Portugal as my country as an example, it's common to say that André Ventura, which is the populist leader of our populist radical right party, Chega, that means enough. It's common to say that André Ventura is just acting like weather vane. Do you know the weather vanes? Yes, the weather vane. Echoing the comment sections of social media, taxi drivers and tavern goers. This is very common to say in Portugal, very concerning André Ventura. But also, we know that moral panic about migration and refugees is produced top down, you know, by those populist leaders. This is why the role of media and the elite is an important topic to address, in fact, and the paper do it. In fact, since the clash of audiences makes populism fashionable, you know, the competition between broadcasts and so on. I know it because I do TV comments, especially in the case of charismatic populists such as Donald Trump. Figures like Donald Trump, the Portuguese André Ventura, Milei, and so on. They are really charismatic, and that's something that attracts the media and make them very fashionable for the audiences. So what I find striking in the results presented is that Trump's cues are not persuasive in a broad sense. They don't expand support across the spectrum. On the contrary, they polarize. Conservatives massively increase their alignment with Trump's position, while liberals move in the opposite direction. So the effect is not persuasion, but mobilization and polarization. Finally, qualitatively speaking, that because I do qualitative analysis, it is in fact crucial to understand if the follow the leader effect is the DNA of the MAGA movement. For instance, if it is a global reaction to social changes, economic anxiety, and migration pressures that Trump knew how to champion. This is crucial for my qualitative perspective. Okay. Paper 3, trying to go forward from economic to political catastrophe. Okay. Another interesting presentation, like all the presentations was, the comparative analysis is robust, I may say. The paper shows well how different national contexts produce different forms of populism after economic crisis. A coup in Thailand, Kirchnerism in Argentina, Trump in the US, and the nationalist left populism in Greece. In the case of Argentina, I think it's interesting to connect that trajectory with today's Milei. Okay, after Kirchnerism, the new crisis opened its space for a complementarily different face of populism, radical libertarian and anti-state, but still using the same populist grammar of El Pueblo against or versus the political caste. This is very structural in all kind of populism. This makes Argentina a perfect example of how crises don't just produce populism, they reshape populism over the time. So the fact of, in fact, the sense of being left behind is central in all kind of populism mobilizations, as we all know and as we all saw. During the Troika period after 2008 crisis, radical left parties experienced significant growth. The radical, for instance, the radical left in Portugal, for instance, experienced a significant growth during that period, electing 19 members of the parliament in 2019, while to this year elections only elected one person, so one member of parliament. This is important to see how the field moves in terms of populism. In the other hand, I think it's very interesting to look to Brazil, while the descamisado, the shirtless, operated as the people during Fernando Collor's presidential campaign, and how it can be related to Brazil. I have a lot of topics. Let's move forward and forget all things I have more to say. And a final relevant topic is the idea of national political culture. I think this is very, very interesting since it matches Fukuyama's and Monk defense of an inclusive nationalism. This is very interesting to be discussed. The sense of community, of belonging remains central to liberal democracy and social contract, and to see how these populist leaders, populist movements affect these social contracts by promoting illiberal tendencies. So the question that remains valid is, does populism depend on economic crisis, or does it just accelerate the social and economic anxiety by providing an anti-establishment voice? This is my question. So let's go for the final presentation. Papandreou ruled in a time when left-wing parties still represented the common people, with an emphasis on the welfare state. So this is an important go-back analysis. It was fantastic, an historical retrospective that helped us to assess how the people shift from left to the right parties. Comparatively, in Portugal, I will use Portugal again. Comparatively, in Portugal, Socialist Party lost part of its voters because it was associated with clientelism and corruption. So this is interesting to compare. I appreciate how the presentation highlighted Papandreou's charisma. In fact, this was crucial to his populist style. His oratory and symbolic gestures made people feel represented after the dictatorship. My question is whether charisma worked mainly as a complement to clientelism, giving legitimacy to a system of patronage, or if it was an independent source of populism appeal. So I think Papandreou can also be read as an example of what we may call cabinet populism, or even executive populism. Its populist style was not only rhetorical, but embedded in the way he governs. Concentrating power in the executive, distributing state resources, and using clientelism as a government tool. This shows that populism it's not just a movement of opposition, but also can be a mode of governance. So my question is this: to what extent did Papandreou strengthen democracy while simultaneously entrenching clientelism practices? How did European integration with the flow of economic funds help to cover or even to exacerbate this paradox of populism and clientelism? This is my questions. Thank you. I think I did it on the time, determined time. Yeah, I respected the time, I think.
Thank you very much. So I think we have to finish in 2 minutes. So yeah. I'm sorry for the discussion. Of course, I just mentioned, we like to mention in the chat here interesting list of questions related to the introduction by David Sanders. I think it would be great, not maybe today, but in the next meeting, in next panels of this very interesting workshop series, to intervene more about the solution, proposition on solution, underlined by David Sanders. It would be great to create a moment of discussion in next meeting. I think the next one is 18 of September. So great moment, great discussion, great meeting today. I'm really, thank you to all. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks, Professor Diaz, for your comments.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. And Mike Makara says thank you.